We've assigned a midterm now, which is designing a character that is for animation. And we've talked a lot in this class already about making sure things are in parts, right? Making sure it's not just one full drawing, which I know this kind of looks like it is, it's not. But we need to talk about the different ways you can break down a character and its joints to facilitate animation and also to like choose a design to focus on. So I have 4 different examples here. These are all student drawings. They are all student characters from this assignment in different semesters, so there may have been slightly different rules about things. And in one case, it is a working professional who made this. But I want to start with one way that you can break down a character, and I call this obvious joints because the jointiness of it is obvious. These are like obviously separate pieces. So she designed this to be she designed it to look like a paper doll cutout thing. So this is like the little pin thing that goes in there, and that's where the joint is. And what that means is that you can rotate these pieces around. Well, not that one, it hasn't been converted yet. There we go. Um, and it doesn't matter that you can see this line behind this piece. You're meant to, right? It is meant to be that this, oops, they're not grouped together, but this is meant to be its own separate piece, and then these are meant to be separate pieces on top of that. So we're playing into the notion of this being a cutout. It is digital cutouts, but digital cutouts are based on the idea of actual cutouts. So this person designed it to look like actual cutouts, so that these pieces would rotate around their various hinge joints, and that would look okay. It looks like hinged pieces. Sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. We have what I call floating joints, and we've talked about this before, but basically having everything be completely disjointed. There are no joints, right? It's all separate pieces floating around. That does mean you have to do a little bit more in terms of animation because, like, where are you going to put these hands, right? Or in terms of the body. Sorry, I've got I'm not entirely familiar with the way these are roundabout. There we go. So if you're going to have the body, these separate pieces, you have to have this animation where the body is kind of floating behind the head, and then this is kind of floating under. Nope. Need both pieces. Need both pieces. There we go. This is interesting. There we go. This can be floating separately here. The whole thing can be floating. It can be a little bit simpler to design, but it requires a little bit more on the animation front, and you will be animating these later. Now for the midterm, don't animate anything for the midterm. Later, many, many weeks from now when we have learned how to animate. On the other opposite end of the spectrum from obvious joints are hidden joints. So this is a character where they're not actually that hidden right now, although I could make them hidden pretty easily. So you do things like there you go, have the character be made out of the same pieces, and so when this moves, the only thing you have to worry about is the outline of the whole thing, right? We can't see where this is overlapping with that. We could see it before if I make it just for funsies. All right, if I make it green, we can see that, and you can design pieces so that it's okay that you can see that. That's another way to go about it. So this would be halfway in between, halfway to what that obvious one was, where it's just, it's a different color. And that's kind of what he did here, where it's behind the body. So these will rotate, from the point that they're supposed to, and right, and so you can get different poses. But we don't see the seams because they are designed to be behind the body. So that is all. Let me undo. That is all perfectly valid. Now the really fun part of this is actually there is a sort of joint right here. And let me zoom in because we're on YouTube. It's the exact same color as the body. And so you can make the character more worried. Or you can make the character angry. right? You can change the or like super surprised. Oh my goodness. Um, you can change the expression on the character with pieces you can't even see. But they would move and they would shift and they would change his expression. Um, so that would be another way to think about it. You kind of cloak the joints. The last one, and again, none of these names are official terminology. They're just what I call things. I call this articulated. This is the hardest thing to pull off. It's also the thing. It's the hardest thing to pull off technologically, but it is the thing that people tend towards because it's how we're used to designing characters. So we have this character here, and all the different pieces are separate and they have outlines, right? So they have outlines just like this one does. But it's still meant to look like a continuous character like the other one is. And if I unbreak their arm for a second, the way this is set up is a little bit different than what we've been doing with parenting. Whoops. Would help if I got all of the pieces. Stand by. There it is. The way this is set up is that you have to be very careful where you put different pivot points. But you can see I can rotate this very far, and they've designed it with that in mind. See how this is curved right here? We can't see that curve when it's like this, so the temptation is to draw the piece and cut it off there. But it continues on underneath. And then that way, you can rotate it. You can rotate it. Well, no one's elbow bends that way, so don't do that. But you can rotate it wherever you need to, and the arm will still look continuous. The other place this happens is over here, although that's a front spot, or a front part, but it's the same with this arm, with including the sword. So this arm, there's all this information that we don't necessarily see. Now, I mentioned before that the person who made this was a working professional. This was someone who has done this before, so they know to arc that a certain way, and they know how to design the feet. Is it this piece? No, it's the whole thing. So that I can... Come on. That's not where you put it. It's always tough when it's not your character. Where to put the rotation point? Nope, definitely not there. They know where to have it arc so that you can have the character... There we go. But you can't go too far because this comes out here. So there's a lot of times when people try to design it like this and they run into this problem afterwards. So how to do this? If you really want to do this, you're going to have to get used to the fact that once we get to handing it in, if before you do animation, I'm going to say things like, well, you have to fix this, 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 and this, right? If you want to fix it beforehand, then that requires setting things up a certain way, putting the pivot point here, turning things into movie clips, and testing it. Does this shape for the body behind the arm work with the rest of this body? Or doesn't it? If I go in here, can I move these different pieces around and have them work properly? I don't know. Let me find out. If you want to have these fully articulated puppet pieces, then you do have to do a lot of trial and error design work, unless you have done this many, many times before. And even then, keep in mind that this character's not necessarily going to bend at the waist. Not without a bunch of replacements, because you can't bend this piece in half. You can't have them walk. Well, don't do that. All right. So there's a lot to look at when we're deciding what kind of pieces to use. And also these are all very much abstracted from reality, right? This is a person. These are less people, but they're still bipeds with essentially 2 arms and 2 legs. This one's the most abstracted, I think. Although this one also has just one thing for a body with the eyes in the middle, and there's no waist. There's no even semblance of it bending at the waist for this character. And one thing you have to contend with is how to abstract from reality to this idea of an arm. And I think for a lot of people this is tempting because there's less abstraction going on. You don't have to simplify it to the point where the hands are two floating orbs. You don't have to break it down into these super flat pieces, right? This has more volume to it, but it is more work with animation and it is more trial and error to set up. So you have to do the work somewhere. There's no shortcut that makes everything easy all the time. Somewhere you're going to have to do a bit of extra work. All right, so that's things to think about in terms of joint types. A second thing to think about is terms of, other things to animate. I'm going to have another video for that so we can break it down, but joints are not the only thing you can animate.